Tonight is not just another night you will forget by morning. It is a window quiet, unnoticed, but powerful through which your mind can be rebuilt or quietly weakened. And what you allow into it before sleep will decide which of those two occurs. Most men never question this. They close their eyes the same way they live their day, scattered, distracted, carrying unfinished thoughts into a state where the mind becomes most receptive. And then they wonder why nothing changes. But nothing changes because nothing is directed. Your body rests. Your mind continues. It replays what you gave it. It strengthens what you repeated. It accepts impressions without resistance, especially in those final moments before sleep when your conscious guard begins to lower. That is where influence deepens, and what enters there stays. Let me ask you something directly. What thoughts have been following you into the night? Not what you claim to believe, but what actually repeats when everything becomes quiet. Because those thoughts are not passive, they are instructions. Most people carry worry into sleep, unfinished problems, doubt, conversations that never resolved. They drift into that state without intention, and the mind accepts it all, repeats it, reinforces it, and returns it to them the next day. That is the cycle, unconscious repetition. And repetition, whether chosen or not, builds belief. Belief shapes action. And action produces results that feel automatic, but were carefully constructed in silence. This is how lives are shaped, not in moments of effort, but in patterns of thought. The problem is not that the mind is weak. It is that it is open to whatever you feed it. And if you do not choose what enters, something else will choose for you: environment, noise, distraction, and the endless flow of unfiltered information. That is how most men are programmed, quietly, consistently, without awareness. But there is another path, a deliberate one, a way to use those same hours not for drift, but for direction, to take control of what enters your mind at its most receptive point and replace random thought with purposeful instruction. Because the subconscious does not question, it accepts. And what it accepts repeatedly, it expresses through your behavior. It shapes how you think, how you act, what you expect, and ultimately what you achieve. This is the law. It works whether you understand it or not. Now, imagine this. Instead of falling asleep with scattered thoughts, you enter the night with focus. Instead of replaying problems, you repeat principles. Instead of drifting into uncertainty, you guide your mind toward clarity and purpose, night after night. Without interruption, something begins to change. Your thinking becomes sharper. Your reactions become more controlled. Your decisions begin to align with something deeper, something that feels natural, but was actually constructed through repetition. That is the power of suggestion, especially before sleep, because in that state, the conscious mind relaxes, resistance fades, and the deeper mind becomes more receptive, more obedient to what it hears, what it repeats, what it accepts. This is why the final thoughts matter. They are not just thoughts, they are commands. Commands that shape identity, commands that direct behavior, commands that, over time, create results that seem effortless but are anything but accidental. Most men ignore this. They treat the night as empty, but it is not empty. It is active. And what you place into it will return to you strengthened. In this lesson, you are not simply listening. You are planting. Each idea, each principle, each repeated phrase is being impressed upon the part of your mind that governs your actions without your awareness. And over time, those impressions begin to guide you without force, but only if they are repeated. This is not about hearing something once. It is about returning to it again and again until it becomes familiar, until it becomes belief, until it becomes you. Because transformation does not happen in a single moment of inspiration. It happens through consistent exposure to the same directed thoughts until they replace what was there before. This is how the mind is rebuilt, from within. So tonight, Do not fall asleep the way you always have. Do not carry the same scattered thoughts into another cycle of unconscious repetition. Instead, choose what enters. Direct it. Feed your mind with something that strengthens rather than weakens, because whether you realize it or not, you are always programming your mind. The only question is, are you doing it by design or by default? There is a moment each night that passes unnoticed by most men. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. Yet within it lies a power that shapes the direction of thought, the formation of belief, and ultimately the course of a man's life. It is the moment just before sleep. If I were to begin again, I would give this moment greater attention than any hour of the day, for it is here that the mind becomes most receptive, not through effort, but through relaxation. The guard that protects it during waking hours begins to lower. Judgment softens, resistance fades, and what enters remains. Most men do not recognize this condition. They move into sleep the same way they move through their day, scattered, distracted, carrying with them unfinished thoughts, unresolved concerns, and impressions gathered without intention. They do not direct their thinking, they allow it, and in allowing it, they surrender control at the very point where control is most possible. The mind, in this state, does not question. It does not evaluate with the same sharpness as before. It accepts, it absorbs, it receives impressions and holds them, not temporarily, but with depth. This is the threshold, the point between conscious direction and subconscious acceptance. If I were beginning again, I would not cross this threshold without purpose, for whatever is carried into it is impressed upon the deeper mind, and what is impressed repeatedly becomes part of the man's thinking not only at night, but throughout the following day. This is not speculation, it is law. A man may spend his waking hours attempting to think clearly, to act with discipline, to direct himself toward a definite aim. Yet if he enters sleep with disorder, if his final thoughts are uncertain, distracted, or weakened, he reinforces that same condition beneath the surface. And what is reinforced returns, quietly, consistently. If I were beginning again, I would not permit this. I would recognize that the final thoughts of the day are not passive. They are active. They are instruction. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between what is chosen and what is allowed. It does not judge whether a thought strengthens or weakens. It accepts what is repeated, and in accepting, it begins to express. Thus, a man who carries worry into sleep strengthens worry. A man who carries doubt into sleep strengthens doubt. A man who carries confusion into sleep awakens with the same. This is the cycle, not imposed, but repeated. If I were beginning again, I would break this cycle, not by resisting thought, but by directing it. For the mind, when left without instruction, returns to what is familiar. It replays what has been repeated. It strengthens what has been emphasized. It does not create new order without guidance. Thus, guidance must be given, especially at this moment. There is also a difference between thinking and impressing. A man may think during the day without effect. His thoughts are interrupted, challenged, replaced. But the thoughts that enter just before sleep are not treated the same. They pass inward. They are held. They are repeated without conscious interference. And in this repetition, they gain influence. If I were beginning again, I would understand this distinction. I would not treat all thinking equally. I would recognize that some thoughts pass, others remain, and those that remain must be chosen. There is also a tendency among men to treat the night as empty, as a period of inactivity. Yet this is not so. The body rests, but the mind continues. It organizes, it processes, it reinforces, and it does so based upon what it has received. If I were beginning again, I would not leave this process unattended. I would not allow my mind to be shaped by accident. I would participate, not through strain, but through selection. through choosing what is repeated in those final moments. There is also a quiet consequence that must be understood. A man who enters sleep with disorder awakens with disorder, not always immediately, but gradually. His thinking becomes less clear, his reactions less controlled, his direction less certain. He may not recognize the cause, yet it is present, formed in silence. If I were beginning again, I would correct this at its source. I would not attempt to repair confusion after it appears. I would prevent it before it is formed. There is also a contrast that becomes visible over time. The man who directs his thoughts before sleep begins to change. His thinking becomes more ordered, his responses more measured, his actions more aligned. He appears calm, certain, deliberate. Others may attribute this to personality, yet it is not personality. It is conditioning, chosen, repeated, applied. If I were beginning again, I would create this condition deliberately, not through effort alone, but through repetition. For repetition impresses, and what is impressed becomes natural. There is also a simplicity to this principle. It does not require complex method. It does not demand extended time. It requires only attention, consistency, and direction to choose. Each night, what enters the mind before sleep, to repeat what strengthens, to avoid what weakens, and to do so without interruption. If I were beginning again, I would treat this as essential, not optional, for it determines the tone of the next day, and the next, and the next. There is also a shift in awareness that occurs. At first, the man must remind himself. He must consciously direct his thoughts. He must choose deliberately. But with repetition, this becomes easier. The mind begins to follow the pattern. It expects instruction. It becomes accustomed to order. And in this, control is established, not through force, but through consistency. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, guard the final thoughts of your day, direct them, choose them. Let this be fixed firmly within. I choose what enters my mind before sleep. I direct my thoughts with purpose. I impress only what strengthens me. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as practice. For the mind, when guided repeatedly at this moment, begins to accept that guidance without resistance. And what is accepted becomes belief. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, I would begin here, at the threshold of sleep. For it is here that the mind is most open. And what enters there will not remain as thought alone, but will return as behavior, as decision, as result. And in directing it, man begins to rebuild himself, quietly, but with certainty. Having understood the power of the mind at the threshold of sleep, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to recognize what occurs after that moment has passed. For the thoughts carried into sleep do not end when consciousness fades. They continue, they repeat, they deepen, and in this repetition, they take form. Most men believe that sleep is a pause, a break from thinking, yet this is not so. The conscious mind rests, but the deeper mind remains active. It does not sleep in the same manner. It processes, it organizes, it reinforces what it has been given. If I were beginning again, I would understand that the final thoughts of the day do not disappear in sleep. They are multiplied. A single thought, repeated before sleep, does not remain single. It becomes many. It is echoed, strengthened, embedded. This is the unseen repetition, the silent continuation that shapes what a man will think upon waking, and more importantly, how he will act. There is a cycle that operates without announcement. A man enters sleep with a thought. That thought is repeated. It becomes familiar. It is accepted. And upon waking, it returns not as suggestion, but as inclination. The man does not say, I am thinking this because I repeated it. He says, this is how I feel. Yet feeling is not the origin, it is the result. If I were beginning again, I would not be misled by this. I would trace the feeling back to its source, to the thought that was repeated, to the impression that was accepted. There are many who awaken with unease without knowing its cause. They feel uncertain. They hesitate. They carry a sense of tension into the day. Yet this condition was not created in the morning. It was formed the night before, through repeated thought, unnoticed, unchallenged. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to correct my state only after waking. I would shape it before sleep. For what is formed in repetition returns in behavior. There is also the matter of expectation. A man does not act only upon what he decides. He acts upon what he expects, and expectation is formed through repetition. If he repeatedly enters sleep with doubt, he begins to expect difficulty. If he repeatedly carries uncertainty, he begins to expect confusion. And expectation directs action, quietly, without effort. If I were beginning again, I would not leave expectation to chance. I would build it through repetition, through directing what is impressed before sleep. There is also a distinction that must be made between thinking once and thinking repeatedly. A single thought may pass, but a repeated thought remains. It gathers strength. It becomes easier to recall, and eventually, it requires no effort at all. It appears naturally. This is how belief is formed, not through force, but through familiarity. If I were beginning again, I would use this principle deliberately. I would repeat thoughts that strengthen direction, that increase certainty, that align with my aim, and I would do so consistently, for consistency gives power to repetition. There is also a danger in unconscious repetition. A man may not choose his thoughts, yet they repeat. Conversations from the day, unresolved concerns, fragments of experience, these return at night, and in returning, they are strengthened. If they are negative, they weaken. If they are uncertain, they confuse. And because they are repeated without awareness, they are accepted without resistance. If I were beginning again, I would interrupt this process, not by force, but by replacement. I would introduce thoughts of my own choosing and repeat them until they replace what would otherwise return. There is also a gradual transformation that occurs through this practice. At first, the man must direct his thoughts with effort. He must choose them consciously. He must repeat them deliberately. But with time, the repetition becomes easier. The thoughts return without effort. They become familiar. And what is familiar becomes natural. Thus, the man awakens with different inclinations. He feels more certain, more composed, more directed, not because something has changed suddenly, but because repetition has altered his internal state. Others will begin to observe this change. They will notice that the man no longer reacts as before. He does not carry the same uncertainty. He does not hesitate unnecessarily. His actions appear more aligned, more consistent. They may attribute this to discipline, yet the cause lies deeper, in repetition, in what has been impressed upon the mind repeatedly, especially in its most receptive state. There is also the compounding effect. A thought repeated one night has influence. A thought repeated many nights becomes dominant. It begins to override what was there before. It replaces, it reshapes, and in time, it governs. If I were beginning again, I would not expect immediate transformation. I would expect accumulation, for the effect of repetition is not sudden. It builds quietly, yet steadily, until change becomes visible. There is also the importance of returning to the same instruction, not once, but repeatedly. A man may hear a principle and agree with it, yet if he does not return to it, it fades, it loses strength, it is replaced by what is repeated more often. If I were beginning again, I would return again and again, until the principle is no longer external, until it becomes part of my thinking. There is also a final understanding. The man who controls repetition controls direction. For repetition forms belief. Belief shapes expectation. Expectation influences action, and action produces result. This chain is constant. It operates whether it is directed or not. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, repeat what strengthens you, especially before sleep. Let this be fixed firmly within. I repeat what builds me. I strengthen what I choose. I carry only directed thought into sleep. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as method. For the mind, when given repeated instruction, accepts it. And what it accepts, it expresses. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having guarded the threshold of sleep, I would do this next. I would control repetition. For in controlling repetition, I would shape what returns to me, not only in thought, but in action, and in the results that follow. Having understood that repetition continues through the night and returns as behavior the following day, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to recognize what that repetition ultimately creates. It does not stop at thought, it becomes identity. A man is not shaped only by what he does. He is shaped by what he repeatedly accepts as true. And what he accepts repeatedly, especially in those unguarded moments before sleep, becomes the way he sees himself. This process is quiet. It does not declare itself, yet it is constant. If I were beginning again, I would not overlook this transformation, for it determines more than action. It determines the man who acts. There is a distinction that must be understood. A man may think a thought once, and it passes. He may repeat a thought, and it remains. But when a thought is repeated continuously, without interruption, it no longer feels like something he is thinking. It feels like something he is. This is the formation of identity. Not sudden, but gradual. A man does not say, I am becoming uncertain. He begins to say, I am uncertain. He does not say, I am repeating doubt. He begins to say, I doubt. The thought has moved from repetition to belief to identity. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this movement. For once a thought becomes identity, it governs action without resistance. The man no longer questions it. He acts in accordance with it, naturally, without effort. There are many who attempt to act with discipline during the day, yet carry conflicting identity within them. They attempt to move forward, yet believe themselves unprepared. They attempt to act decisively, yet carry uncertainty beneath the surface. This creates conflict, and conflict weakens action. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to force action against identity. I would shape identity itself, for when identity is aligned, action follows without strain. There is also the role of repetition in this process. Identity is not formed through a single statement. It is formed through repeated impression, night after night, thought after thought, until the idea becomes familiar, and familiarity becomes acceptance. If I were beginning again, I would not rely upon occasional instruction. I would rely upon consistent repetition, for consistency gives permanence. There is also a danger that must be understood. Identity may be formed unconsciously. A man may not choose what he becomes. He may simply absorb from environment, from conversation, from repeated thought, and in absorbing, he adopts, not deliberately, but gradually. If I were beginning again, I would not permit this. I would choose what I become through what I repeat, especially at night. When the mind accepts without question, there is also a transformation that occurs when identity begins to change. At first, the man feels a difference. His thinking shifts slightly. He notices new inclinations, new tendencies. He begins to respond differently, not completely, but noticeably. This is the beginning. If he continues, the change deepens. The new thoughts return more easily. The old thoughts appear less often. And in time, the new identity begins to take hold. The man no longer feels as he once did. He no longer reacts as he once did. He begins to operate from a different center. If I were beginning again, I would continue through this stage, for it is not immediate. It requires repetition, but once formed, it is powerful. There is also the effect this has on action. A man who sees himself as uncertain hesitates. A man who sees himself as directed proceeds. A man who sees himself as capable acts. These actions do not require persuasion. They arise naturally from identity. Thus, identity removes effort. It replaces struggle with alignment. If I were beginning again, I would build identity deliberately, not through declaration alone, but through repeated instruction, until it becomes natural. There is also the perception of others. A man whose identity is formed through directed thought appears different. He does not speak with hesitation. He does not move with uncertainty. He carries himself with quiet certainty. Others may not understand the cause, but they recognize the effect. They see consistency. They see clarity. They see direction. And in this, they place trust. For men trust those who appear certain of themselves, not through display, but through consistency of action. If I were beginning again, I would not seek to appear different. I would become different through identity. For what is real requires no display. There is also the distinction between forced behavior and natural expression. A man may attempt to act confidently. He may imitate behavior. Yet if his identity does not match, the effort is visible. It feels strained. It does not sustain. But when identity is aligned, behavior flows. It requires no force. It becomes natural. If I were beginning again, I would not imitate. I would construct through repetition, through nightly instruction, through consistent impression, until what I think matches what I do, and what I do reflects who I am. There is also the permanence of identity once formed. A repeated thought may fade, a belief may weaken, but identity, once established, remains. It continues to influence action without effort. Thus, the importance of forming it correctly. If I were beginning again, I would not allow identity to be shaped by accident. I would shape it through choice, through repetition, through direction. There is also a final realization. A man does not become what he wishes. He becomes what he repeatedly accepts. And what he accepts most deeply is what he carries into sleep. For in that state, acceptance is strongest. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, choose who you become, and repeat it, especially at night. Let this be fixed firmly within. I become what I repeatedly impress upon my mind. I shape my identity through thought. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as creation. For the mind, when given repeated identity, accepts it, and when it accepts, it expresses. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having controlled repetition, I would do this next. I would build identity through nightly instruction, through consistent thought, until what I repeat becomes what I am, and what I am begins to shape everything I do. Having understood that, identity is formed. Through repeated thought, especially in the receptive moments before sleep, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to recognize that the mind cannot be left empty. It must be directed. For if it is not directed, it will not remain still. It will drift. And in drifting, it will return to what is familiar. Most men attempt to remove unwanted thought. They resist it. They struggle against it. Yet resistance alone does not remove it. For the mind does not respond to absence. It responds to presence. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to remove disorder by force. I would replace it. For what is replaced loses its influence, and what is introduced gains it. This is the principle of substitution, simple yet powerful. A man who attempts to eliminate worry without introducing clarity will continue to worry. A man who attempts to remove doubt without reinforcing certainty will continue to doubt, for the mind returns to what it knows, unless it is given something else to follow. If I were beginning again, I would give it direction, especially before sleep. There is a tendency among men to allow the mind to wander at night, to revisit the events of the day, to replay conversations, to consider problems without resolution. These thoughts appear harmless, yet they are not, for they are repeated, and in repetition they are strengthened. If they are uncertain, uncertainty grows. If they are unresolved, confusion deepens. If I were beginning again, I would not permit this wandering. I would guide it, not harshly, but deliberately. I would choose what enters, and I would repeat it until it replaces what would otherwise return. There is also a concept that must be understood. The mind feeds. It consumes thought as the body consumes food, and what it consumes regularly becomes its condition. If it is fed disorder, it produces disorder. If it is fed clarity, it produces...
What you have just listened to was only the first half of this lecture. Access the full lecture through the first link in the description. By the way, hey, I'm Jan, the founder of this channel. I've started this channel and wanted to stay in the background and keep the main focus on the message of this channel. But as our community continued to grow, I decided to take the responsibility and step up and build a community around these teachings. So hey, nice to meet you, I'm Jan, and don't forget to access the full tape through the first link in the description.